In so many ways, the future of the American economy looks bright. The rise of AI, a manufacturing renaissance, a booming clean tech sector, and this continued economic competitiveness is a fundamental source of geopolitical strength. But all of that is going to take far more electricity. The challenge is that for the last 2 decades or so, the US power sector has essentially seen little to no growth. So the fundamental basics of this sector are changing under our feet. How do we respond? And how do we meet this growing demand while keeping the grid resilient, affordable, and ever cleaner? Welcome to CSIS. My name is McGeady. I'm a fellow with the Energy Security and Climate Change Program. Today I'm joined by 2 excellent experts to discuss these questions. Rob Gramlich, founder and president of Grid Strategies, and Brian Janous, former vice president of energy at Microsoft and co-founder of Cloverleaf Infrastructure. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
So to start off, Rob, your team, and sort of the reason why we're having this conversation initially was your team put together a report that just caught my attention and I think is really sort of important for laying out the conversation. So can you just tell us a little bit about what that study found and sort of some of the big statistics that you saw in that data?
Sure. Well, at Grid Strategies, we were doing both sort of electric industry analysis like we normally do, but also just talking to people like Brian and other people in the industry who, through their sort of statements and body language, were saying, oh my gosh, power demand is really going crazy here. We don't think the sector's doing enough to accommodate it. And so we decided to take a look, and the conclusion of our paper is right there in the title: the era of flat power demand is over. So we looked at all of the utility filings to their federal regulator, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and combined that with a whole bunch of anecdotes from different states, regions, utility statements from different sectors, from data centers to manufacturing to electric vehicle and heat pump, and all of these other sort of different technical new uses coming onto the system, and it sort of added up to, it's quite clear that the things that were happening in the 60s and the 70s, that was one era, the 80s, 90s, another era, and then for the aughts and the tens, that was basically flat, just no power demand, but now we see a clear kink up in the curve. Don't know if it's 1% a year, 5% a year, where exactly that's going to land, but everybody in every region and every utility now need to get their load forecasters back and start planning for that, because they're going to need to know what that number is and plan for it.
Yeah, you mentioned the era. You mentioned eras, and I think for folks sort of internal to the industry, sometimes this is sort of obvious, but I think zooming out, it's really important to sort of understand the context of this sector. I've got 3 statistics that I think are so illuminating. So in 2023, the U.S. consumed roughly 4 trillion kilowatt hours. In 2000, that number was a little bit less. So 2 decades ago, 3.5 trillion kilowatt hours in a year. So some demand growth over the last 2 decades or so, not a lot. If you go back 40 years prior to 1960, we were well under 1 trillion kilowatt hours a year, only 700 billion kilowatt hours in a year. So over those 40 years, the system quadrupled and more, actually far more. And then the last 20 years, the system has basically had to just flatline, maintain some minor growth. And so all of a sudden we're now, like you said, that demand curve is just shifting up. So in the context of the industry mindset, what does this mean? How would you say this? The industry is. What does this mean from a thinking perspective? How we're thinking about this?
Yeah, I mean it's a muscle memory that I hope is not completely lost. But it used to be the way in the utility sector, in the power industry, that you would have a forecasting department, you would have people who work on growth, they were building new infrastructure, there were transmission planners who were thinking about big, long lines and working those and building those and the generation to go along with it. a lot of that went away. There has been a fair amount of generation development in the last couple of years, mainly because of the transition. There's just normal, attrition of generation, as well as clean energy goals and different preferences to replace older, mostly coal, but 67-year-old plants. But the transmission infrastructure, we benefited from 40 years of a little bit of cushion and overhead. That's gone. A lot of the distribution system story is the same. So we sort of, as an industry, as a whole industry with all the stakeholders and regulators in the power sector, lost a lot of that infrastructure building mindset and tools. And that's what, there's a lot of inertia there. So we need to somehow, jumpstart ourselves out of it. In particular, and Brian will maybe talk about this, is, there's a lot of reasons why a lot of the individual drivers of this growth can't really talk publicly about what they're doing. Maybe they don't even know, but also, this is a capitalist economy. You're not telling all your competitors everything you're doing. So somebody needs to tell this story of, hey, everybody, wake up. We got a lot of growth here. We need to address it.
Yeah, and this is a nation. Your report kind of emphasizes this. This is not a specific utility. Those specific utilities have some really insane stories in terms of load growth. But this is across many utilities, across many states, across different regions, ISOs, markets, whatever. This is a macro phenomenon, but it's a phenomenon driven fundamentally sort of by private actors, by a vast number of decentralized, disaggregated private actors. And so, Brian, to you, you are someone who has spent a decade plus acting as the customer. In the electric power sector, the customer is the consumer of load. That is the fundamental customer of the industry, of all the generation, of all the transmission, all the investments. Who is the customer? It's the load customer. Right. And so I'm curious from the perspective of the customer, what does this load growth look like? What does it feel like? What are the challenges that the customer is dealing with?
Yeah, and you're exactly right. And one of the things I've always said is everyone has to remember that every dollar in this industry comes from someone's utility bill.
Yeah.
Like that's where all the money comes from, to build power plants, to build transmission lines, to make all these investments. And what's important to see, and you noted that in your intro, is that we're also talking about economic development and growth. We're talking about jobs. I mean, electrons equal jobs. They equal tax revenue, right? And if you're a business, whether you're a data center or you're looking to build a new manufacturing facility, what you're looking for is energy, and you're looking for clean energy. But what's critical is the most important thing is timing. When is that power going to be available? Because if you think about the economic opportunities that we're talking about, let's just take AI, for instance, that's probably $1 trillion pie. And so whoever is building the machines that are going to do the generative AI, whoever builds those biggest and fastest and first is going to have a competitive advantage against everyone else. And so everyone is looking for how quickly can we get GPUs, start plugging them into the system, and as a result, create jobs and create economic opportunity and create innovation that we desperately need as a country. But it all is predicated on being able to get access to electrons.
Yeah, and I think when I moved to a new house, my electricity, I don't have to apply to the utility for electricity. I get my account set up and it flows, right? Or if I open a pizza shop at the empty storefront down the street, the electricity just flows. But that is not the dynamic if you want to build a massive factory, right? If you want to build a massive AI center, it's not like you just get to plug in your extension cord. And so you have to go to the utility and propose this project. And what is a generic customer? Not Microsoft, not a EV factory, but just a generic, large industrial commercial customer. When they go to a utility, what does that conversation sound like?
Well, it's all a question about scale, right? And so if you're not constraining the existing system, then it's saying, okay, well, it may take 12 months to order some transformers and build you a substation and you can plug in. But what we're seeing today is those 12 months are becoming 36 months, are becoming 72 months, and even longer, especially as you start talking about larger and larger installations. Because these are all, as you said, if I'm building a brand new data center or a new battery manufacturing facility in the United States, there's not an existing one for me to go say, oh, I'm just going to replace that one. It's like, no, this is all incremental load. And I think this is part of the challenge. And of course, I was looking at it through the lens of data centers, but we have secular trends across increased manufacturing in the United States driven by IRA. We have vehicle electrification, which despite the stories to the contrary, is actually growing relatively fast. I think the only thing growing faster than that is stories saying it's not growing fast, but it's a rapid adoption of all of this is incremental, right? I mean, so this is all additive to the system. And so everyone is going after the same commodity, which is not just electricity, but actually clean electricity, because most of these businesses are looking for that as well. And we didn't even mention hydrogen production and things of converting energy into fuels, right? So everyone is seeking that same commodity. And so even though, as you said, there's not like a clear signal, as Rob was talking about, because oftentimes, they're not sending long-term signals about how much we're going to need next year, the year after that. And they may be talking to their existing utility about load growth, but they're not talking to the utility next door where they're going to go next week or next year to say, hey, I want another 500 megawatts or gigawatt. And so we don't have a good national signal for how much electricity we actually need in this country.
Yeah, it sounds like a strong case for planning. And in particular, generic commercial entity, private firm X can probably barely plan for its own load growth, right? It kind of has a sense of what's going on with its company, its plans, but it can't account for its competition. It can't account for the industries that it doesn't directly compete with, but is, as you mentioned, competing for the same electrons. So it just, it's driven by the private sector. It's driven by all these individual actors, but it's actually something that needs to be sort of aggregated up and dealt with at sort of a industry-wide or sectoral scale. And so,
well, just to add to that, even thinking about the whole AI question, NVIDIA was not a household name even a year and a half ago, right? NVIDIA is a $2 trillion company today, right? No one really expected AI to take off the way that it did. And we all talked about AI, we knew it was happening, but the rapid adoption of ChatGPT specifically was just head spinning like that. No one saw that coming in quite the wave that it came. And now we're talking about massive amounts of investment that's necessary to support that industry. We'll get there, but it's a huge shift in terms of, again, predicting, is it 1% or 2% or 5%? Nobody knows. But AI was a little bit of a surprise in terms of how fast it came on the scene and how much power it's going to take to build that industry.
Yeah, and on that topic of AI, makes me think, on Monday, we had Commerce Secretary Raimondo here, and she sort of issued a call to action on semiconductors. Obviously, the CHIPS office has a lot of money to deploy into the semiconductors industry, and that is going swimmingly. But the scale of investment to build these semiconductor factories, so we can build the chips, so that we can power the AI industry, because in her words, this is basically akin to the space race. So it's not just competition between Microsoft and Meta or the tech sector versus the hydrogen sector in terms of competing for the electrons. This is it boils up into a geopolitical competition of who can enable these industries to scale at whatever rate they need to scale to win the space race of this generation. And so it's easy to get lost in the weeds of this specific utility's planning or this state's regulatory policies. But this becomes very quickly fundamentally a strategic question. And so I guess that this brings us to planning and the role of planning. Rob, can you just tell us a little bit about so we've got load growth. You mentioned the utilities this is a muscle that needs to be kind of redeveloped. Where in the sort of the ecosystem does this planning take place, and is it sufficient, or how do we shift the planning landscape to account for this new phenomenon?
Sure. Well, I completely agree that we need to plan now, and we being sort of collectively as a system, to just put it on the next data center applying for interconnection just doesn't work, partly because of the efficiency of putting it all together. There are major economies of scale and scope when if you plan for that use and the chips and the other manufacturing and the electrification and all of these things that are on the system together, plus that's all on the load side. And on the generation side, you got 2 terawatts, which is a very large number of wind, solar, and storage plants stuck in the interconnection queue trying to get connected, fundamentally having the same problem of insufficient grid capacity to get connected. So you got the load and the generation who would love to meet up and buy from each other, but they're stuck, prevented from a constrained grid. So then, first of all, it's interesting. We need to sort of get over any philosophical problems we may have with planning. It may sound inconsistent with a capitalist free market economy, but how are we delivering our agricultural products? It's over roads that were planned, bridges, ports, all of this infrastructure was planned in some way for multiple purposes to benefit multiple people across wide areas. So we need to do that. So who specifically? The electric industry is a very unusual industry for most of the listeners here. It might sort of be unfamiliar. We have about 330 transmission owners that are utilities around the country. They can sort of plan their little narrow area, but we really need them to work together on robust regional networks because the electrons don't care about state boundaries or utility boundaries. They flow everywhere. So really, the critical thing, I think, is the regional planning entities, which are semi-developed. Over the last 20 years, we've had these organizations called regional transmission organizations. They, by and large, do a very good job at what they do, but they're not really, we'll maybe get into this, they're not really doing the long-term 20-year planning that is needed to take into account all of these uses. So there's some policies going on to address that, and then, so that's sort of one level, but also just each utility talking to their customers and their potential customers about the local system and the more lower voltage distribution system. There's a lot of that as well. So there's not really there's not any single place in the federal government you go where it's not like the Pentagon addresses, military bases. They're like, It's diffuse. It's mostly regulated public utilities under economic regulators, state commissions, and then the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission are the sort of the main places where that happens.
Yeah, and so it sounds like you've got industry, private industry, desperate for electrons across a whole number of sectors, right? Whether it's AI, whether it's semiconductors, whether it's EV battery manufacturing facilities, whatever. It's homes electrifying, quite frankly. It's also residential demand, right? Mm-hmm. So the challenge, of course, is that you need to sort of transcend some of these various sectoral dilemmas. You need to transcend some of these boundaries, and you need to take bets over the long term, over the 20-year, 30-year, 40-year horizon, because it's unclear sort of how much and where this load will show up. So historically, the challenge with investments, we mentioned this, is costs, right? Investments are great because it's jobs, but also from the point of view of a ratepayer, investments end up on the bill. And so in the past, let's say 20 years, when load was flat, planning these investments was sort of difficult because that was just going to get added on top of this existing pool of load. But with this load growth now, how does that change the calculus? And I'll leave it to you either if you did kind of take a swing at that.
I'll jump. I mean, because as Rob was talking about before, we've been through this era of no load growth, so we've sort of forgotten how to do this. And I think we underestimate human capacity to forget how to do things as a society, right? Yeah. And we really don't know how to plan. And if you go back to rural electrification, it's like we were investing in electric poles and wires because we knew that if we did that, people would buy toasters and they'd buy irons and then eventually buy televisions, and it was an investment in the fact that people will use more of this if we build it. And now we're in this era where we desperately need it, but utilities don't, because of the regulatory structures that exist, they don't have an incentive model that says go build ahead of that demand or in anticipation of that demand or to attract that demand.
Yeah.
As Rob said earlier, they wait for a customer to show up and say, may I please interconnect? And then they go, well, maybe. We'll see if we can figure that out, right? And so that model doesn't work. That model works fine in an era of mostly no load growth. It does not work in an era of probably even 1 or 2% load growth, because as you said, that pie starts to get really big as you get out even a few years into the future. And if you're not, and the bigger that delta gets, the longer the lead time is to fix it.
Yeah.
I want to jump in. I'm glad you asked about rates, because everything in the electric industry, it's a regulated industry by
It's
and
rates,
large,
you know,
right?
it's
So, and it's consumer
rates and it's
advocates
costs, yeah.
and state and federal regulators. Their MO is, keep rates low. They want reliable service, low rates, right? And as they should, right? And we work for, we have clients that are consumer advocates and buyer side, and that's what they should want. But we need to think about this. It's another muscle memory thing, I think, because we need to think about this differently. It's like, it's almost as simple as you're out with your friends, and the bill comes in, it's going to be $200, and then it looks like 3 or 4 more friends are going to show up, and the bill is now a $400 dinner. Oh my God, that's a huge cost. Well, no, but actually we're spreading the costs over a lot more people. There's a denominator here and a numerator, right? So the rates don't necessarily go up when you build this infrastructure. We got a lot more people, Brian's former company, and that whole data center, industry and semiconductors and everybody who's electrifying, including me. When I put the level 2 charger at my house, I'm, even though my local electric company tells me I'm doing terrible on energy efficiency, now that I've got an electric, hot water heater and car charger, I'm actually doing pretty darn well. But I'm using more electricity, no question. We're all, there's going to be a lot of these uses, and we're all going to pay more, and so it's spread across, a larger base. And it's sort of like tax policy, a larger base. It's not, it keeps the rates, affordable for everybody. So we need to, in the regulatory process, need to keep that in mind, that these new uses, yes, they're adding load, but yes, they're also adding people who are paying for it.
Yeah, and the load doesn't show up unless you build the investments and create the room for that load to show up. So there really is this need for foresight and taking this long-term view, because the demand is sort of this amorphous thing waiting in the wings, sort of to arrive if the grid capacity was there. And the last 2 decades we've had spare capacity on the grid, which has allowed some of this data centers, allowed some of this industry to sort of fill in without this becoming a problem. But that spare capacity has just shrunk, and now we're down to the bone. It's the margins are thin, and it's time to sort of re-engage in the long-term view. And I'm thinking of Phoenix or something out west, right? When we built the first long-distance transmission lines out there to connect hydro dams and build hydro dams out in the American West and to electrify the American West, Nobody could have foreseen that Phoenix would become the metropolis that it is today. It is a vast city that just didn't exist 50 years ago when the first investments that enabled that load to showed up. And that's the time frame we need to sort of be thinking about at the strategic level. So let's quickly move on here because we only have so much time. We're in DC. We focus on, as you mentioned, this is a huge sector. It's industry, it's state policymakers, it's utility folks. But we're in DC. So at a federal level, what does the federal government have to do? What can the federal government do, both in terms of supporting states, but also supporting companies?
Sure, I can start on a very high level. This is still a private industry. It'll be private companies with private capital building almost all the transmission, the grid infrastructure we need, but the government can help a great deal. So the Department of Energy has a new office, a grid deployment office. They have financing tools, permitting tools, and other sorts of ways that they can help and work with states to help get the right kind of transmission built and funded. That's one thing. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, is the kind of the economic regulator for the industry. They can encourage or require, as I think they probably will soon, long-term planning. Plan for the transmission infrastructure based on the anticipated future generation and load. As you mentioned, Cy, there is risk there. What we know about forecasts is that they're all wrong. But like erring on the side of too little is equally dangerous, if not more dangerous, given our current situation. So we need to make sure that the regional grid planners do their job and plan for, say, 20 years out for that anticipated future generation and load. Not rocket science in terms of a concept. And historically, this is definitely something that was done. The utilities, used to do this kind of thing all the time, but we haven't been doing it later. In fact, we've really been doing barely any forward-looking planning outside of just a couple of regions. So, having the federal regulator essentially require that is key. The third thing is Congress is taking a new hard look at permitting reform. And I think, that leads to some tough conversations. Nobody wants to, undermine the underlying environmental statutes that NEPA implements. But there are process, delays and, just problems with how we get big stuff permitted and moving forward, and how we plan and pay for transmission. So I think that's very important. Election year, not the greatest year for passing legislation, but they are working very hard, at least in the Senate Energy Committee. So I'm hopeful something will come out of that.
Yeah, and election year, jobs are always on the menu, and this is fundamentally a question about the economy, and erring on the side of too little risks sort of constraining economic growth, which is just nobody wants to see that.
Yeah.
The role of private companies, both in terms of the government supporting private companies, but also I'm curious, what the big load customers can do to help change perspectives in the regulatory community, the policymaking community.
Yeah, part of it is focusing on, how do we get more out of the system we have right now? Because, everything we're talking about, long-term planning, building transmission, building new generation, that all takes a long time. And there's a lot of development that we want to do in the next few years that is going to come well ahead of when we get a lot of these things built. And so I know another thing FERC is considering right now is the role of grid enhancing technologies. These are things like dynamic line rating and transmission optimization that allow, with sensors to get a better understanding of how much capacity do we actually have on the system, and how do we really push customers to start working with their utilities to demand these sorts of innovations be applied inside of their systems. And this is one thing that I was doing at Microsoft and I'm continuing to think about now, which is, the voice of the customer is very powerful. Because the voice of the customer is the one saying, hey, I want to give you more money. I want to bring more jobs into your community and into your state. But you need to do some certain things for me, utility, in terms of how you're making investments in your system to ensure that I can make those investments as soon as possible.
Yeah. The customer is the focus of this industry, right? Resilience, affordability, meeting their specific requirements in terms of the composition of the energy. And making sure that the customer gets the most bang for the buck invested, I think, is really important. And so, Rob, can you just mention, I guess, there's a right way to go about spending customer dollars and a wrong way, and how do we make sure that these investments get done sort of most efficiently, because there is a lot of money needs to get invested. How do we do this in a way that sort of protects the rate, maximizes ratepayer value? Right.
Yeah. Well, I'll focus on two, because there's actually a lot of right ways and a lot of wrong ways. But two right ways are, number one, capture the economies of scale and scope of addressing all these needs together. Transmission is, in some ways, a classic natural monopoly, just lower cost per delivered megawatt if you build a higher voltage, let's say a 765 kV line compared to a lower 230 or something. So
it's like building a big highway instead of building a bunch of small country roads.
That's right. Bigger is better in an asset that has those properties, and that's just the way it is for transmission, which is great. But it means you need to proactively plan for the what you're going to need over 10 or 20 years in order to capture those efficiencies. So real economic efficiency that consumers benefit from. And so that proactive planning stands in great contrast to what we're doing today, which I describe as the most expensive way you could do transmission, which is the incremental reactive approach. If you just kind of take the next data center or the next storage plant or solar plant and just build enough infrastructure for that next use, that is necessarily more expensive than doing the proactive multi-purpose planning. So that's at the core of what this FERC rule that the Chairman Phillips said he's plans to issue this spring, is proactively plan to capture those efficiencies. Consumers will be better off. Just and reasonable rates will result, and in fact, if we don't do that, it's unjust and unreasonable. So that they're in fact sort of compelled to do that. So that proactive planning is one way to just do it correctly for the customer in the long run. The other is technology. So Brian mentioned a few dynamic line ratings, topology optimization, power flow control. There's advanced conductors. There's superconductors. There's these. Some of them are so cheap that it's even hard to get utilities to pay attention to them, which is just one of these ways the industry is weird in terms of the incentives. Others cost some money, like there's an incremental cost for a conductor that doesn't sag, but they can deliver twice as much power sometimes, so you need to pay a little bit more to get a lot more. So there again, that sort of requires a different set of policy and regulations. It's all entirely, both of these things are entirely within the power of the economic regulators, the PUCs, the state regulators, and FERC. But again, it's different, it's new, it's not what has been done, and there's all this inertia and natural conservatism of utilities to address, to incorporate new technologies. So we need to somehow accelerate that. I know the Department of Energy is trying to do that, and some at FERC are trying to do that, and some of the states. But the technology options and the proactive planning are the right ways that we really need to improve to do this better for customers.
Yeah, there's an inherent, kind of sort of conservatism within the utilities and also within the regulators, because they want to protect the customer, right? And so this is the broad mindset shift that we're talking about that may need to change in the years to come. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you both for joining me. Thank you everyone watching online. Thank you for coming to CSIS. And I'll just reiterate that the risk of underbuilding is sort of broad constraints on economic activity and broad sort of undermining of strategic objectives, whereas the risks of overbuilding are minimal because of the opportunities presented by these technologies and industries. Thank you all. See you next time.